Kermit, West Virginia, is a rural town with a population of just 392 people. Yet, between 2006 and 2011, a single pharmacy in this tiny community received nearly 9 million hydrocodone pills. How does a system designed to protect public health allow millions of highly addictive narcotics to flood a town with fewer than 400 residents? The answer lies not just with the doctors writing the prescriptions, or the manufacturers aggressively marketing the drugs, but in the shadowy middle layer of the pharmaceutical supply chain. This is the story of how the three largest drug distributors in the United States quietly fueled the opioid crisis, prioritizing profit over their legal and ethical obligations to the American public. When we think of the opioid epidemic, names like Purdue Pharma and OxyContin immediately come to mind. But the architecture of this crisis relied heavily on the logistical giants known as the Big Three distributors. These are McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen. Together, they control approximately 90% of the nation's wholesale prescription drug market. Their job is seemingly straightforward. They buy medications from manufacturers and deliver them to pharmacies, hospitals, and clinics. However, under the Controlled Substances Act, these distributors are not just delivery services. They are legally mandated gatekeepers. They are required to monitor, identify, and report suspicious orders of controlled substances to the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. An order is deemed suspicious if it is of unusual size, deviates substantially from a normal pattern, or is placed with unusual frequency. According to congressional committee reports and thousands of pages of court documents, these gatekeepers systematically left the gates wide open. Instead of halting shipments that flagged their internal monitoring systems, the Big Three routinely approved them, prioritizing sales volume and market share over regulatory compliance and public safety. In a span of just 7 years, from 2006 to 2012, distributors shipped more than 76 billion oxycodone and hydrocodone pills across America. The sheer volume should have triggered alarms in every corporate boardroom and regulatory office in the country. Yet the pills kept flowing. The systemic vulnerability persisted. But how exactly did these sophisticated multi-billion-dollar corporations justify ignoring such glaring anomalies? The answer involves a deliberate dismantling of internal safeguards. To understand the mechanics of this failure, we must look at how suspicious order monitoring was actually implemented. Investigations by the Washington Post and the House Energy and Commerce Committee reveal that compliance departments within these companies were often underfunded, understaffed, and routinely overruled by sales divisions. When a pharmacy's order triggered a red flag, the standard operating procedure should have been to hold the shipment and investigate. Instead, companies frequently raised the pharmacy's threshold, which is the maximum number of pills they were allowed to buy, allowing the inflated order to pass through the system undetected. This practice effectively normalized anomalous behavior. In one documented instance, a distributor shipped over 3 million opioid pills to a single pharmacy in a small Colorado town within a single year, repeatedly ignoring warnings from their own internal investigators. This unchecked flow directly facilitated what law enforcement calls diversion. Diversion occurs when legally manufactured controlled substances are redirected into the illicit market. When a pharmacy in a town of 300 people receives millions of pills, those drugs are not staying in the medicine cabinets of local patients. They are being diverted to the black market, sold on the streets, and trafficked across state lines. The distributors had access to the precise data needed to spot this diversion in real time. They knew exactly how many pills were going to every pharmacy in the country. Yet, according to testimony from former DEA officials, the companies frequently failed to report these staggering numbers to the authorities until long after the damage was done. The shadows of those early red flags still loomed over the escalating death toll. The DEA was not entirely blind to this crisis. In the mid-2000s, the agency's Office of Diversion Control launched an aggressive campaign targeting the distributors. They utilized their most powerful enforcement tool, the immediate suspension order. This order allowed the DEA to instantly freeze a distributor's ability to ship controlled substances from specific warehouses if they posed an imminent danger to public health. By hitting the distributors' distribution centers, the DEA aimed to choke off the supply of diverted pills at the source. For a brief period, this aggressive enforcement strategy seemed to be working. Fines were levied, and distribution centers were temporarily shut down. But this initial regulatory pushback would soon be neutralized by a sophisticated, well-funded counterattack. As we will soon uncover, the pharmaceutical industry did not just fight the DEA in court, they fundamentally changed the rules of the game in Washington. The turning point arrived when the industry mobilized its immense lobbying power to strip the DEA of its sharpest teeth. Uncovering the extent of this lobbying effort reveals a masterclass in corporate influence. According to a joint investigation by The Washington Post and 60 Minutes, a coalition of pharmaceutical companies, led by the major distributors, spent over $100 million lobbying Congress to pass a seemingly obscure piece of legislation. This law, the Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Drug Enforcement Act of 2016, fundamentally altered the legal standard required for the DEA to issue an immediate suspension order. Instead of demonstrating an imminent danger to public health, the DEA now had to prove a substantial likelihood of an immediate threat that could result in death, serious bodily harm, or abuse. This subtle change in legal terminology had a catastrophic impact on enforcement. It raised the burden of proof so high that it effectively paralyzed the DEA's ability to freeze suspicious shipments. Former DEA investigators testified that cases they had spent years building against distributors were suddenly dropped or settled for fractions of the proposed fines. The number of immediate suspension orders issued by the agency plummeted. The watchdogs had been successfully muzzled. The lessons from that early regulatory failure never faded. With the DEA's primary weapon neutralized, the distributors were largely left to police themselves, a strategy that had already proven disastrous. Let us examine the granular reality of this self-policing. Court records from the massive multi-district opioid litigation in Ohio paint a damning picture of corporate culture. Internal emails from executives at AmerisourceBergen, for example, casually referred to opioid pills as hillbilly heroin, demonstrating a shocking awareness of the drug's illicit use and devastating impact. At Cardinal Health, investigators found that between 2008 and 2011, the company reported 0 suspicious orders from its Florida distribution centers, even as the state became the epicenter of the nation's pill mill epidemic. A pill mill is a clinic or doctor's office that prescribes powerful narcotics for cash, with little to no medical justification. Millions of pills flowed from Cardinal Health warehouses directly into these illicit operations, yet the company's internal monitors remained silent. McKesson, the largest of the three, faced similar scrutiny. In 2008, the company paid a $13.2 million fine to the DEA for failing to report suspicious orders. As part of the settlement, McKesson promised to implement a robust compliance program. However, an investigation by the Department of Justice later revealed that the company systematically failed to design and implement these promised safeguards. From 2008 to 2013, McKesson supplied increasing amounts of oxycodone and hydrocodone to pharmacies across the country, frequently ignoring its own internal volume limits. In 2017, the company reached another settlement with the government, this time paying a record $150 million. But in the context of a corporation generating hundreds of billions in annual revenue, these fines were often viewed not as a deterrent, but as the cost of doing business. The financial architecture of this crisis reveals a deeply flawed incentive structure within the healthcare supply chain. Distributors operate on razor-thin profit margins, making volume the primary driver of revenue. Every pill shipped, regardless of its ultimate destination, contributed to the bottom line. Furthermore, executive compensation was frequently tied to sales growth, creating immense internal pressure to approve orders and expand market share. This relentless pursuit of profit blinded corporate leadership to the human cost of their logistics network. The systemic negligence was not an accident of oversight, but a feature of a business model that prioritized infinite growth over legal obligations and public health. The reckoning, when it finally arrived, was immense in scale, but arguably insufficient in consequence. In 2021, McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen, along with manufacturer Johnson & Johnson, agreed to a landmark $26 billion global settlement to resolve thousands of lawsuits brought by state and local governments. The funds are earmarked for addiction treatment, prevention, and recovery programs across America. As part of the agreement, the distributors were also required to establish an independent clearinghouse to track their shipments and share data. While this settlement represents one of the largest corporate accountability actions in American history, critics argue it pales in comparison to the estimated $2.5 trillion economic cost of the opioid crisis, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of lives lost. The story of how drug distributors failed America is a profound lesson in the dangers of regulatory capture and corporate impunity. It exposes a fatal flaw in relying on profit-driven entities to self-regulate highly dangerous products. The legal obligations to monitor and report suspicious orders were clear, but the mechanisms to enforce those obligations were systematically dismantled by the very industry they were meant to constrain. While the massive settlements and new oversight measures offer some course correction, The fundamental vulnerability of the pharmaceutical supply chain remains a pressing concern. The opioid epidemic was not a natural disaster. It was a crisis engineered by a complex network of corporate actors, facilitated by regulatory blind spots, and sustained by a relentless drive for profit. The distributors, operating in the shadows of the supply chain, provided the logistical backbone for this tragedy. They possessed the data, the resources, and the legal mandate to stop the flow of diverted pills, yet they consistently chose to look the other way. Decoding this system reveals a chilling truth. When the pursuit of market dominance supersedes the imperative of public safety, the consequences are measured not just in dollars, but in human lives. The echoes of this systemic failure will resonate in American communities for generations to come,